Welcome to Fuqua's LinkedIn Live session. Every Wednesday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time, Fuqua faculty are coming to you live on LinkedIn. I'm Adriano Rampini. I'm the William and Sue Gross Professor of Financial Economics at Fuqua, where I teach the core finance course and a PhD to daytime MBA and executive MBA students, and a PhD course in corporate finance theory. Today, I'm going to talk about some of my recent research on corporate risk management. I will be answering your questions, so please leave them in the comment section, and I'm going to get started. All right, so I'm going to talk about what I call the risk management paradox. Why firms should hedge and why many don't. I'm going to start with some motivating evidence on risk management. And then I'm going to ask the question, why should firms hedge? And essentially the existing theory of why firms should hedge is that they should hedge to ensure that they have sufficient funds in states of the world where their cash flows or net worth is limited, essentially sufficient net worth to pursue positive NPV projects. I'm gonna then talk about why, in fact, in practice, many firms don't hedge. And what I'm gonna argue is, based on my own work, that the trouble with hedging is that it requires collateral. And firms that have limited funds, in fact, might rather use that collateral elsewhere to finance investment. So I'm going to then look at the empirical evidence on risk management, in particular at fuel price risk management by airlines. And I'm going to ask which firms actually do hedge in practice and what explains it. And we're going to find one basic pattern, which is that firms with limited internal funds actually hedge less or potentially not at all. So the paradox then is that financing is both the reason why firms should hedge, but it's also at the same time the main obstacle to hedging. All right, so let's start with some evidence. So this actually is part of a research agenda that I've been pursuing with one of my colleagues here at Fuqua, Vish Viswanathan, and some other co-authors. We essentially developed a theory of risk management in over several papers, and then studied the empirical patterns in risk management among airlines in a paper that followed. So here's the motivating evidence. There's substantial variation in fuel price risk management by airlines. So we're using here airlines as our empirical laboratory. We have data from 1996 to 2009, and airlines actually, we use airlines data actually and airlines annual reports, and conveniently airlines tell you what fraction of next year's expected fuel expense they've hedged. Using that data, we find that on average, airlines hedge about 20% of next year's expected fuel expense, typically. But there is substantial variation, as you see in the picture. For example, Southwest here at the high end hedges more than 50% of its 1 year expected fuel expense, and is the biggest hedger. But you see that many airlines actually hedge very little. What we asked ourselves is, what explains this variation, and what can it tell us about what the reasons are why firms might hedge, and what the obstacles are to hedging. So let me maybe start by telling you what is the existing way people think about why firms should hedge. This existing way, again, is essentially to argue that firms should hedge to ensure that they have sufficient funds in states of the world where cash flow drops and they would otherwise be constrained. This goes back to a paper by Fruchtschaften and Stein in the Journal of Finance. And the interesting observation is, of course, we know that firms really should be risk neutral. So you might ask yourself, why should firms hedge to begin with? Well, what they showed is that if firms have limited funds, then in fact, it's as if the firms are risk averse. So take a firm, for example, that has an airline, if you want. Tomorrow, next year, it's going to have two states. There's going to be two states of the world. In a high state of the world up here, the airline will have plenty of funds. This would be, for example, the state of the world where fuel prices are low and so cash flows are high. In contrast, in this low state down here, fuel prices are actually high and hence cash flows low. And if the airline doesn't do anything about it, what will happen is that it might have limited funds and won't be able to pursue positive investment opportunities, meaning won't be able to add those extra routes that look profitable and so on. And what was pointed out is that, well, a risk manager would allow the firm to take funds from the high state tomorrow and shift them to the low state tomorrow, and in the process then ensure that the firm, the airline, has sufficient funds in the state of the world where fuel prices are high to pursue positive NPV projects and avoid downsizing. Okay, so what that then says is firms should hedge when they're concerned about limited funds. So it should, because hedging allows them to carry extra funds into states of the world where they otherwise would be limited. Okay, so far so good. In fact, what Fruchtschaften and Stein concluded is that firms should hedge perfectly. They should make sure that they have essentially sufficient funds in all states of the world. Now, of course, in practice doesn't look like this. And so this got us thinking about what might be the main obstacles to hedging. So, in fact, commentators have pointed out that this really raises a puzzle because firms in practice hedge very little. And for example, one commentator wrote that the actual corporate use of derivatives does not seem to correspond closely to theory. So that's where our new theory comes in. So our new theory essentially thinks more explicitly about financial constraints, and in particular thinks about the need to collateralize promises. Okay, we developed this in two papers, one in the Journal of Finance and one in the Journal of Financial Economics. And essentially the basic idea is that collateral is needed both to raise financing and for risk management, as I'll explain. And this can explain why firms, or that are in particular firms that are financially constrained, might actually choose to hedge very little or not at all. So let's go back to our picture here. So I want to remind you that the way we think about this is there's a high state of the world where we're going to have plenty of cash flow. There's a low state of the world where the firm has limited cash flow. Now, what we are asking here is, well, suppose the firm is actually constrained at time zero. So it has limited funds at time zero. And now both hedging and financing require funds. So here's what's going to happen. So what the firm will do is, if it has limited funds at time zero, what it will do is, in the high state tomorrow, it has plenty of funds. So it's going to shift resources from the high state tomorrow to today to finance current investment. In fact, if it's sufficiently constrained today, it might even shift funds from the high state, from the low state tomorrow to today to finance current investment. Okay. Implicitly, what it is not doing, it's not shifting funds across the two states. Why? Well, because effectively funds are needed, are so urgently needed here at time zero that it shifts as much as possible to time zero and does not shift funds back into the low state tomorrow. So essentially, the firm that is financially constrained, if you want, has bigger fish to fry. Financing operations today may be more urgent than ensuring that the firm has sufficient funds in the low state tomorrow. So what you find is constrained firms then use their limited funds at time zero to essentially hedge, to finance investment, so to operate more aircraft, downsize less, and not for risk management. If you indulge me, let me briefly show you. So let's just take a brief look under the hood here at what a model, such a model might look like. So here's a model which is written down in equations to think about the dynamics, but in fact, it's going to be very simple. So essentially, what does airline management need to do every period? It needs to decide how much to invest, how many aircraft to deploy, how much financing to raise. It needs to decide on the hedging policy and potentially decide how many dividends to pay. Its objective is to maximize the value of the firm. And then there's a bunch of constraints. These are budget constraints, but the one I want to focus on here is actually the collateral constraint, which says that the collateral, which is essentially, you can think of it as the various aircraft that the airline has. The collateral has to back both the promises to the financiers with interest that have to be repaid with interest, as well as their hedging needs. So essentially, the model says, well, if you have an aircraft and you use it to back a promise to a financing counterparty, well, then you can't pledge the same aircraft to a hedging counterparty. So that's what's under the hood here. But let us go on and look at the data some more. So as I mentioned, the empirical laboratory that we studied is the fuel price risk management in airlines. And again, the basic pattern is that financially constrained firms hedge less or potentially not at all. So let's see. I'm bringing back here the motivating evidence. So this was, we saw a lot of cross-sectional variation, so a substantial variation in fuel price hedging across airline. Now I wanted to point out two things. Recall that Southwest was here the airline that hedged the most. Well, it also turns out that Southwest is the best capitalized airline in this period. Similarly, we saw that there's quite a few airlines that hedge almost nothing at all. And it turns out that these are the small airlines that we typically think of as also more financially constrained. So this is at least suggestive that possibly variation in how financially constrained the airlines are would explain this variation. And how financially constrained airlines are, we measure by their net worth. All right, so this was essentially our starting point then. So then we looked at the cross-section of airlines over time more formally, and we said, and the evidence then shows that airlines with stronger balance sheets hedge more. How do we measure how well capitalized or how strong the balance sheet is? Well, we have a bunch of measures in the papers. The ones I want to highlight today are the net worth of the airline. Essentially, you can think of it as the market value of the airline relative to its assets, as well as its credit rating. And so what you see here in the picture is on the x-axis, you have the measure of net worth. And then on the y-axis, we have how much is being hedged. And what you see quite clearly is that the better capitalized airlines also hedge a whole lot more. And you see this both when you measure, whether you measure the extent to which financial constraints constrain things by net worth to assets or by the credit rating. What is the size of these circles, by the way? Is essentially this is the size of the assets of the various airlines. So you see essentially also in this picture at the same time size, and of course this what we have up here is Southwest. Okay, so this is cross-sectional evidence comparing across airlines, and in fact, just to speak more explicitly to our mechanism, we read the airline 10Ks carefully. And for example, in this period, when you read the Southwest Airlines 10Ks, what you find is that they actually had an explicit agreement to pledge aircraft, 737-800s, as collateral to hedging counterparties. So, and of course, once they pledge to the hedging counterparty as collateral, you can't also borrow against the same aircraft. So, and that is, of course, exactly the trade-off that our theory highlights, and that we think is at the heart of the basic corporate risk management patterns. All right, so we pushed this further and said, okay, so let's look within an airline over time and what can we say? For example, American Airlines in their 10K, they make statements such as a deterioration of the company's financial position could negatively affect the company's ability to hedge fuel in the future. Inspired by that, we look at within the airline, let's see the same airline over time, and let's look at what happens when an airline hits financial distress, which we have here. So what do we mean by distress? By distress, we mean the credit rating drops to CCC+ or below, okay? And so what we do here is we plot this, so this is at time 0 is when the credit rating of the airline drops to CCC+ or below. Well, if you look, 2 years before, the airlines that eventually go into distress hedge about 30% of next year's full expense. Even the year before, they still hedge about 25%. But when they hit distress, they cut hedging almost completely. After that, it recovers, but slowly. And then we essentially text searched the 10Ks to think about, well, how do they explain it? And we looked for collateral. And essentially 2 years before, collateral is not mentioned in the context of risk management. And that a fraction of firms that mention collateral goes up to about 2/3, which mention collateral at the time when they hit financial distress. So collateral then essentially seems to be the main obstacle to hedging at those times. Now, in some related work, which I'm just going to briefly mention, we actually think about household risk management. Now, household risk management, typically when we think about household risk management, we think about, we call it household insurance. But we think actually there's very similar patterns in household insurance. And in fact, we think a similar trade-off applies. Essentially, so this is ongoing research, essentially more financially constrained households, we argue, buy less insurance. And we think this is the case both in terms of life insurance, property casualty, health insurance, and so on. And the question is why? Okay. Again, cross-sectionally, of course, there may be many mechanisms. But we think, for example, that households or consumers that get more constrained, that hit on hard times, for example, they might drop their renter's insurance, reduce their car insurance in terms of, or switch from comprehensive insurance to collision insurance, or increase their deductibles, and they might even increase, they might even lapse their life insurance. And again, we think it's a similar mechanism, and essentially the problem with insurance is that the insurance premia are paid up front. And so what that means is that if you're very financially constrained, well, essentially suppose, for example, you are concerned about, you have limited funds and your car just broke down, well, you can spend the limited funds on repairing your car and getting to work, or on buying a car insurance. Well, you might forego car insurance in order to instead fix the car. So what's interesting about this is you actually see similar patterns even in insurance, in microinsurance for rice farmers in village India who insure their crop or insure against the lack of rainfall. And essentially, there's a similar pattern in risk management in corporate America, in insurance in among US consumers, and in rice farmers in village India. And we think it's all a result of what we like to call the risk management paradox. So that financing is both the reason and the main obstacle to hedging or insurance. So the reason for hedging, we've argued, is to avoid financial constraints. And firms use their limited funds for operations instead of hedging. There were empirical puzzles, and empirical puzzles call for new theory. And by providing this new theory, first, we think we understand the facts better, but then also, of course, and importantly, we think the theory then provides useful guidance for risk management in practice. So this is essentially what I wanted to say. So I would be very happy to answer some questions now, if you have them. So please add your questions to the comment section. Let me maybe get started with one question here. This is from Ethan. Does the preference for time zero investment imply that all marginal valuable investment options will be exhausted before the firms choose to hedge? So that's an interesting question. So the question is essentially does it mean that the firm needs to be completely unconstrained to start hedging? And the answer to that is no. Essentially what it says, though, is that if the firm is very constrained, the marginal investment opportunities right now are so high that the firm will, in fact, forgo hedging completely. But as it gets more constrained, essentially what happens is the firm starts to hedge even before it has exploited all marginal investment opportunities. Why? Well, because essentially not hedging will mean that in the low cash flow state tomorrow or low net worth state tomorrow, it will have to forgo investment opportunities. And if it forgoes investment opportunities at that time, then essentially what happens is that it will want to have the marginal investment opportunity today equal the marginal investment opportunity in the low state tomorrow. So that's an interesting question. So let me see whether I have another question here. So here's a question, and it asks how much. So Brady asks, how much does management sophistication, knowledge of hedging, play into smaller firms not hedging? So that's also a good question. So it is true that, of course, to run a hedging program, the firm needs to have some knowledge of hedging instruments. That said, though, and this could, of course, be a factor in explaining the cross-section. What we thought was interesting and useful to think about is when you think about the variation in hedging by firms over time, what you find is that the more as firms get more financially constrained, as we saw in the airlines, they reduce the amount of hedging. They don't completely stop. They reduce it at the margin, at the intensive margin. So what that means is, and what that to us suggests, that it is financial constraints, not sophistication, because it's hard to argue that as the firm gets more financially constrained, that it would become less sophisticated, if you want. So because of this, we think that within firm variation suggests that it's financial constraints rather than sophistication. But certainly for a long time, people had only cross-sectional data. And when they had only cross-sectional data, certainly the sophistication of the management team was a potential explanation of the cross-sectional facts. We think that within facts are actually very telling that maybe it is in fact first order the financial constraints rather than sophistication. Let me take maybe one more question. Here's another question, which is buying calls does not require collateral. Does this get around the problem? So that's another very good question, right? Because we have sort of emphasized that risk management positions need to be collateralized. You may not want to pledge. Airlines may choose not to pledge as much collateral. But then you say, well, if I just buy a call option, and in fact, airlines do that to some extent, a call option on fuel price on fuel. Well, I pay a premium up front, but then after that, I just get paid, so I don't need any collateral for that. Well, the trouble with this, of course, is that I have to pay the premium up front, and that eats into my net worth that I could otherwise use to deploy extra aircraft. So essentially, this is in fact exactly, in fact, in one case of an airline in bankruptcy, that is just what happened. They were actually considering doing some risk management by buying call options, but they quickly decided that they wouldn't be able to run their business. They wouldn't have enough funds to run the business if they would use all a significant amount of net worth to pay the premium on the call options. I think that's almost all the time we have. So thank you very much for joining us. Next week, Professor Victor Bennett will discuss the prospects for small businesses under the Biden administration. And you can follow Fuqua LinkedIn to be alerted to these and other events. Thanks again for joining us today, and I hope you found today's session interesting.